and we'll have a virtual event, which will be an artist talk with Angel, who's also one of our artists we're featuring in this exhibition. But now we're going to focus on our task for tonight, which is to have our two artists speak about the history and also their work, to give artist talks about how their work is impacted by past Chicanx artists, but also really how they're taking this into the future. And so this has been a really extraordinary event. We had a great reception a few weeks ago where all of the artists came, and we were able to celebrate the work and the exhibition. And so these events that we're having throughout the semester is a continuation of that celebration. So our first artist, Luis Valderas, is a multimedia, multidisciplinary artist and educator based in San Antonio. The imagery in his artwork is based on Mesoamerican mythology, combined with science fiction, cosmology, and ancestral narratives. Valderas transforms ancient icons by revealing their connection between past, present, and future. His own visual language exists in the third space of reality, the frontera where anything is possible. Through mixed media work, Valderas presents an art experience that prompts spectators to imagine and participate an intermingled future. Please welcome Luis.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. I'm Luis Valderas. I appreciate you all being here tonight for this talk that we're going to have. Yareth and I go back a long ways, and I'm super excited to be here sharing the spotlight with her. With Yareth, and I appreciate everything you've done as well, Yareth. I'm originally from the Frontera, from South Texas, and so I grew up in McAllen. McAllen is right about 5 minutes away from the border. I have a lot of imagery that is kind of influenced and based on that, but I also grew up during the space race. And one of the very first things that I remember seeing on TV was a black and white version of the launch, of the landing on the moon. And so that just really impacted me. And then after I began working, then I started exploring. So this is a shot on the way down south to El Valle. Real quick, the presentation that I have made, if you scan that QR code, you can save it and use it later, because I'm going to go through the presentation quickly and just stop at some key things. Okay. So this is the piece that's on location at the gallery up top, and it is a portal. It's been installed once before in San Antonio, but it's meant to establish the cardinal directions and develop an experience with the community that comes into sit and act within it. What influenced me to begin in this approach on how I make things and what Chicano futurism means to me and how I've been exploring it throughout the years is followed by an approach of indigenous as information and knowledge, connected also with Jungian ideas of self-awareness and consciousness. So in here I kind of created a diagram of how I look at things and how I address things in the movement or in whatever I make, because I make mnemonic objects. Mnemonic objects are objects that teach a knowledge through the reference and the image and symbol that they represent. Some of the books you might want to pick up on is 9 Seasons Beyond 2012 by Dr. Carlos Aceves. You'll find the footnote on the slides at the bottom. But I'm also a member of the Tanco Collective here in San Marcos, where I've been studying indigenous information and practices. So that's one of the things that's influenced my work. Now, going to the installation. What you see on the upper left-hand side is the diagram of how the entire installation in the portal is set up. It's laid out on the cardinal directions of the earth. The ancients would create place by setting up the cardinal directions at a location, and we start with the directions north, south, east-west, and then the center point would be the axis mundi. And that's the way they would also establish the milpas, which is how they would plant the rows of corn intermingled with the three sisters, squash and chile and beans. And this is a symbiotic relationship that these plants have, but more so it represents the symbiotic relationship that a community has with itself. So in the circle that you see right there represents the creation of a community based on the milpa process, where the portal is activated by people stepping in between the cardinal directions. Now, in this portal installation that I presented, the figurines at the bottom, these are all mauls. They're jaws of earth monster beasts, but they're sticking their tongues out, and their tongues are two-sided. They have a reflection, a mirror on one side, and they have textural patterns on the other end, and they're coming up behind the bacabs. These forms are all bacabs that hold up the cardinal directions of the universe. And in ancient times, when our ancestors in Mesoamerica established the location and established temples, they were always established temples based according to the directions, the cardinal directions, and then also the cosmology, the stars in the constellation of Orion and several other constellations. So in this case, the mouth is open so that people can reflect and they can stand in a circle and create a community. And this is a term. This is kind of related to the indigenous practice of establishing a circle and then talking on equal terms with each other and passing around the talking stick or the talking stone or the object that gives us each other our presence and our position to be able to speak and have a voice in the community. But more importantly, it's a representation of the respect that you get within a community and how a community can move forward and grow and support itself. Just like the milpa and the three sisters, they have a symbiotic relationship that supports each other, helps each other grow. So that piece is activated for that same reason when people stand in between, because what happens is that they can look to the right and to the left, and they can see reflections of themselves and other people as well in two places at the same time. So what's happening is a visual distortion of reality. And that is a conceptual idea of existing in that third space, Nepantla. So this is kind of what I just explained earlier. And in this case, the diagrams they're set up to be in the cardinal direction. So you'll notice up in the gallery that it's slightly off from the direction, and the directions are labeled. So most of the times we have an idea of which way is north. Some of us can carry a really good feeling of and presence of where that is, but sometimes when things are changed around, we have difficulty in establishing and understanding our presence and our location. Another thing that influenced my piece is monument number 9, and that was just repatriated to Mexico. And it's an ancient Olmec monument dated to 800 BCE, and it represents the entrance to the underworld. And as you can see, the four corners are set up to be part of the open mouth of the entrance to the underworld. And in this case, that center is right at the middle. However, the community is standing around the outside of the circle to understand and take into to recognize the entrance. Because one of the things that happened on a previous installation was the tongues of these malls were bent forward. So if you're familiar with the concept of the infinity mirror, where you can stand a mirror at just the right angle and then you can see various directions, when the mirrors are facing forward, the focal point is down in the center. And after I went to describe the way the portal works, there was a number of people that would sit and meditate in the center, were having experiences of connecting to a different realm simply by meditating. So we begin with the identity and then lead back to the community circle in the installation. This is how I made these pieces. I find that I recycle materials and I mismatch. This is raspachismo. So I grew up in the barrio, and you have to make do with what you got. But more importantly, I also grew up in a flower shop and in a ceramic shop. So I learned to make do and connect things together. My pieces are made out of styrofoam and ceramic heads and wood structures. But more importantly, they are also made of just primarily electronic shipping components. The packaging used in electronic shipping, so there's something having to do with the engineering of how those pieces are protected. They give very specific forms and patterns, and I was able to cut them up, deconstruct them, and rearrange them into figures. And so I felt like a foam monger instead of a fishmonger. But that kind of flows into what I've been doing for a while, which is combining my different objects that I make to other refuse material. For example, these are calaveras that I put into an installation for Dia de los Muertos, because I also create those portals as well. And the calaveras are ceramic, but the big styrofoam pieces for the fruits, they're styrofoam. And you know, for example, the strawberry is the very first fruit that comes in the spring. So it's the fruit that gives us hope. Watermelons are real special. That's all I'm going to say right now. Okay. But I started working on watermelons for back in what is it, 2012, something like that. Or actually, you'll see 2004 was the very first incarnation of the watermelons, and these are temples. These are portals created during Dia de los Muertos, because that's what they really are. If you're doing it right, you have the installation layered in the 3 steps at least, and then you have the 4 elements of the universe represented: earth, wind, fire, and water. And then you have all the other necessary items and objects in the altar. Oh, this is where I grew up at. That's my mom's flower shop, ceramic shop. We used to make Dia de los Muertos wreaths and things for that. So those are all cultural practices that I learned to keep alive. That's my mom, and that's my dad. My dad's off in this other journey already. So, but my mom's still down south. But going back to futurism, so we talked about how futurism began in Italy during the Italian era, and I was just talking to Peter and looking at the idea that this was about 100 years ago, when we were dealing with ideas of looking at things from a different perspective. The flyers that were flying Italian airplanes found this out, and they discovered that and began pushing this forward. So that was the beginning. And so in my case, I just mix and match and use materials that I combine, and I've had to learn all this through the work at in the ceramic studio from when I was a little kid. But it definitely made me see the temporality of everything around us. We were, unless you're a mountain, or unless you're the ocean, or unless you're the sky, everything else is temporal and has its very specific time frame. So according to Catherine Ramirez, PhD, she was one of the very first ones to write about Chicano futurism. It addresses and retells stories of first contact, colonialism, displacement, labor migration, resistance, and social cultural transformation in the Americas. And so she's one of the, she's the mother of futurism, of Chicano futurism. She was one of the first to write about it and collect it. So with cultural rituals that I create, it requires the making of objects that are imbued with that contextual knowledge. The objects that they, like I said, act as mnemonic tools through visual information received by the viewer to convey different information. So this is a circle that we created when me and my partner created a large print and turned a football stadium into a temple. This was site-specific, time-specific, so we made it on the celebration of Huitzilopochtli, a feast day. And so the influence is the temple at Teotihuacan. And so what I do is recombine my objects. I feel I've done stage work before and set design. And so with that in mind, I create objects that I can rearrange, replace, and continue with the contextual ideas that I'm representing. The skulls, I cast about 30 years ago. Well, actually 2004. And I've let them age. And so I'll cast about 50 of them, they age, and they become part of my objects. But one of my biggest things that I've done is create this installation right in front of the Alamo, well, down the street from it. That's my dad. I come up with this idea. One time we went to visit Bristol, and if you ever read Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, came up with this idea of mariachi visiting King Arthur's Court as well. And so why not have him visit and time travel in San Antonio? And he's time traveling now that they're redoing the Alamo Plaza, and he's overlooking the battlefield. So I think that's one of my funnest installations. But yes, going back to retelling the story of Mesoamerican and then rearranging. These are two large prints that I make in large steamroll events, and I hand colored the one on the right, and using inks, and in the case of the skin, that's powdered chocolate that I sprayed on with a rudimentary air gun. You know, just using a straw. And one of the things you might want to read and look up on is Jose Vasconcelos' idea of la raza cósmica. I put a link on the slideshow to UNAM's copy of it. It's all in Spanish, so you might need to translate it. But about 100 years ago, the ideas of utopia and concepts of the future were floating around, and combinations of how people would come together and form one cosmic race, because there's going to be so much intermingling. We have no business with nationalism anymore, and we haven't learned that yet. But we're 100 years later, and maybe we can make a difference. Back in the 60s, when the Chicano movement started, and there was people that were exploring this idea. One of my mentors did the same thing, and Chista Cantu with La Raza Cósmica as well. And in the meanwhile, Afrofuturism was going strong with Sun Ra, and then we have Octavia Butler writing about ideas of futurism, of feminism. And so we go back to how I play around with those things in different arrangements. So transforming simple icons into objects like that. And that tells the story of the frontera and the border, and people losing their lives crossing the river, and throwing it into a little future realm with metallic corncob rockets and different incantations of it. And where am I at now? Well, Chicano futurism is manifesting itself as a speculative hybridization of future realities that exist in the same time as the now in Pantla. So that's off of one of the recent things that we did. We created a Chicano futurist art movie, and this is the Portal Arrival team. Because 20 years ago, I started Project Masa, and which is Chicanos in Outer Space. I met the guys from Royal Chicano Air Force, and I got permission. You know, it was the idea that oftentimes as an artist, you feel like you're hesitant to jump into the void, into something different that's new. And when I was doing stuff that had to do with rockets in outer space and combining them with Chicano ideas, it wasn't very well accepted in the beginning. It was back in '94 when I started doing this. And so, but I kept with it. And finally, after meeting those guys, I decided to start our own space agency. And this is the crazy timeline that that's happened since then. So I think I'm out of time. Yeah. But thank you so much for listening to me. And this has been certainly a growing experience for myself, and a learning experience, because I'm constantly learning from everything I do. And I'm constantly learning from everybody I run into and falls into my orbit. Yareth has been in my orbit for, oh my gosh, what, 15 years, más? And everybody that I work together with is like that. And I really feel blessed that I'm here sharing this with you all, so that we can continue moving forward and adding to this. So please access the slideshow. There's references that you can read up on and use, and then feel free to contact me if you have any questions. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Luis. And I do want to make a special note, really. The reason that we had this exhibition, this whole project is stemming from conversations that Luis and I have had when we had another exhibition project a few years ago. So it's just a wonderful, I don't want to say it's full circle, because the journey is only partway through, but this is another step along the way of I think learning. It's about acceptance. It's about thinking it's about history. It's all of these things combined. So I really want to thank you for bringing that all to us tonight, in the past, and hopefully in the future. So our next artist, Yareth, before I introduce Yareth, we are going to have a world premiere of a video that we just finished, which was a time-lapse video of the installation that's upstairs. This wonderful mural project, 3D elements. And as we get ready to show the video, I really want to thank Jeremy Brown, who works for the Dean's office here in the Division of Arts and Digital Media, who put a lot of effort into this video to make it really wonderful. So the video itself is a time-lapse video of the installation that happened here in the galleries, really the month, August, September, 1 month. It was a really incredible production. And I want to thank the team here at TAG. I want to thank Bess, I want to thank Ellen, and I want to thank Bailey in particular for all of their efforts in making this happen and working with Yareth to have this spectacular work. So we'll play the video and then I'll come back after it's done. So I just, we really wanted to show that video to show how painstaking this process was, and how it's only here for this semester. So it's an ephemeral work. And so if you haven't seen it, those of you on Zoom, those of you that are here tonight, we can go upstairs after, but please spend some time and come back multiple times to view the work. And I just also want to I didn't say this before, but those of you on Zoom, we're going to have a Q&A after, at the end of the event tonight. So if you have questions, please put them in the chat and we'll have those answered. So if you have questions for Luis, start thinking of them now. Okay, now I'm going to introduce Yareth Fernandez. Yareth Fernandez is a mixed media artist and arts educator based in Austin. Their work experiments with artificial environments and futurist ways of interacting with nature through site-specific installation work that respond to various landscapes, including the Mexico-U.S. border. They investigate different solutions for possible environmental extinctions, often creating spaces that reflect nonlinear time, invented organisms, systems of growing, and geometrical frameworks. Their vibrant and colorful installations provoke ways to rethink how we coexist with the natural world through art, science, and imagination. Please join me in welcoming Yareth.
Thank you, Peter. Hi, my name is Yareth Fernandez, and first of all, I feel very honored to be part of this exhibition with Luis. As he mentioned, we've known each other for a while, but I think he has sort of like pulled me to his world, and I always felt like my work doesn't really fit in other places, so I think I found a place. And also, I'm very grateful for the team of the gallery, because this type of work that I do now, I can't do it unless I can have people that can support me. So I really appreciate that. This is one of my leaf designs. I will go back into it, but I'm gonna start with some of my older work and then work my way into the piece that is upstairs, and then kind of go back into some of the previous pieces as well. Not sure, like, which is power down. Not sure. I mean, this is what the next slide, but I don't know if. Yeah, so this one is called Tesoros Nacionales, National Treasures, and this one was done at Mexicarte Museum a couple of years ago. And so all of my work focuses on nature around the border. I'm originally from the border, and I grew up in Mexico, in Matamoros, and so I grew up crossing the border almost every week. And so I think that experience really has shaped me in why I talk about nature right now, because when I was a kid growing up, like looking at the border wasn't really about nature. It was about, bridges, lots of traffic, immigration issues, drug issues, and that kind of stuff. So I really wanted to focus on kind of giving a different perspective of what the border is, because there's a lot of beauty and there's a lot of plants and organisms that only exist there. So we have a very unique ecosystems there. So this wasn't the first one that I did about the border, but this one is focusing on some places in the border where the construction of the newer wall was happening a couple of years ago. It's already real and present, but it was there was a lot of disturbances on the area's construction, which then affects the plant. So there is a very nice butterfly center in, I think it's Mission, Texas. And so this one is centered around that. And this particular installation has two other pieces adjacent. Some of it, one of it on the left is bisons, and the other one is a cloud that shows the border, yeah. Okay, is it supposed to be this one?
It's supposed to be that one.
And I'm supposed to,
Yeah, wait.
can we go to the next slide?
Yeah, just ask them to advance if they can go back there. Sorry.
I'm sorry. Okay, next. Yeah, so I like to focus on organisms throughout the border. And so this is how I started. I kind of started to look just at the border, but it's like 1,500 miles of border, right? So there's a lot of organisms. And so the bisons, there's in some point in Arizona where there's a herd of bisons that cross. And so one of the things that the bisons did, because there was a border wall that was a mesh style. There's different styles of border walls, really. And so that one's a mesh style. And so it kept getting put up. And so the bisons would just kind of like go through them and make holes for them, kind of just opening their own path. And so the beauty about that is that it will create some sort of path for other organisms to go through, you know, so. And so a lot of the, my idea with this type of work is that really there is no border, right? So it's a construct, and I like to take a look at nature to get that point across. Okay, there. So this one is one of my biggest installations. This one was done at the Mexican American Cultural Center here in Austin. This was done in 2019. Also, in the last one I show you, I had someone help me be able to finish this installation. This one is 40 feet in length, and this is the map of the border. And so in one point, that will be like Brownsville over there, and then San Diego over here. And if you think of the line of the and start seeing it. And then I also use a lot of very small elements that I like to add on the wall directly, like you saw in the video. And so in a way, I start to deconstruct imagery in a way. So what you see in the center, there are mountains, and that's done with nails and thread. And then the grasslands and the plains are by in the corner, right? So those are just, I think I use lollipop sticks, and those were directly on the wall. And so there's also like a lot of warp of perspectives that I do on my work. Cacti done with pompons, and yeah. And so there's always elements that I paint, and for this one, it was just a design. And as I kept moving through my ideas on installation work, those designs became more specific, right? So on this one, it was a sort of the construction of the border wall. So those are thinking of colors of the border, like thinking of oxidized metal. This one is the shortest installation that I've done in an amount of time. It's called Jackrabbit Star. And I did this at University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign campus, which is about an hour away from Chicago. And so I had 1 week, and so this was done in about 4 days and a half. And it was up for 1 day, and that was it. And it was a mini residency. It was 1 week. And so I just flew there, and I had to be resourceful. And so I just worked with black and white. I had a can of white paint, a can of black paint. They had rolls of craft paper, and so I just used that to my advantage because I could use as much as I could. The little things that you see floating, well, they're not floating, but they're attached. Those are leaves that I picked up from the ground. They're very dreamy. I don't know if you've ever been north. They kind of look like they're whirling down like little helicopters. I used to live in Michigan, so I had seen those before, and so I painted those. And so for this installation, here, this was done last year, and I was already thinking more specific of plants in South Texas back at home, which is Rio Grande Valley. And so this, well, this is actually a video of, it's a stop motion of the installation. And so the plants are milkweed prostrate, and so they only grow in Starr County. And there was like a play of words that kept repeating with this installation because they kind of look like Starr, and then they are in Starr County. And then I started working with a jackrabbit. The jackrabbit is a star also in my work. And let me see if I can play it again. Yeah. And so he's supposed to sort of be bringing kind of light to the endangered species of the border. And so he's sort of like walking around, also like war perspectives, because the plants look like they are like this, but really you will look at them down, right? So it's a different perspective. And then looking up at the sky would be looking at the stars, but the jackrabbit is like facing, right? And also personifying a star. There is also a hair constellation, so all of it kind of play together to create the installation. And so this is the most recent installation upstairs. And I never done an installation with so much detail. And this is a landscape in South Texas. And the name also transboundary landscape comes from the idea of nature existing the same in both sides of the border, right? So again, the idea that a border is just a construct and that nature is a really good way to understand that is the same in any place. And for me, as someone that, again, grew up in the border, I never really realized that until like I was older. And there was a trip that I took a while back to Big Bend, where you can actually cross into Mexico. And that was the first time that I saw nature without any barriers. And it was like mind-blowing to me to be able to see nature like that, and that it could exist, and it does exist. So on this one, I focus on landscape in South Texas in Starr County. And so I was actually getting very interested in the plants there. So I took a trip in the summer, and so I documented plants, and I was looking for endangered plants. And so I took a friend with me that could help me find the plants. And so it was a very short trip, but I ended up finding a plant nursery, and the guy that was there was an ethnobotanist that was just all into endangered plants in this area. And so he was growing some in his nursery. And so I got to see some of those plants. I didn't even have to go too far. But we also went out into public land and tried to look for plants. And so that's where this piece comes from. And so the lines painted on the back are barreta trees, and those are only found in Starr County. And then the ones in the bottom are golden bush, and the ones that are in the center top are hibiscus, heartleaf hibiscus plants. And in Spanish, I think it's called tulipán del monte. And then the seed pods and the plant leaf design comes from a yellow show, and that one it's not considered endangered, but it's a rare plant in also South Texas. And so what I'm trying to do is just kind of present nature in a different way. Also a landscape. It's really hard if anybody, paint landscapes or you're familiar with landscapes. They can be very difficult to kind of separate different types of plants. And so I really wanted to focus on each one of them individually. So the ones at the bottom are the golden bush, and they have yellow flowers, and that's where all of those pins and pompons are used. So I like to use things that I can just represent plants. Things are very simple. I also make my own pieces like the seed pods and leaf designs. And so overall, I see this type of process like just drawing in a very large piece of paper that I can't keep. So yeah, so back to the trip, this is more or less how South Texas Star County looks like. And so there's tons of plants in that time. I think it was only 2 to 3 days, and we were able to identify like maybe 15 plants or so. And it was a process of photographs and also collecting plants. And so these are some other of plants that grow. And so plants also grow in community, right? And so some of them were photographed and some of them are collected. The ones that I was able to collect are plants that are abundant, you know, and so people cannot collect endangered species. It's illegal. So these ones, we were collecting them and we were focusing on the scientific name, but it's very difficult to remember those. But I can tell you this is the golden bush, and that's the bareta tree specimens. And so I find a lot of inspiration in nature, but also science and plant collection. So this is an original herbarium specimen from University of Texas. And so this is the milkweed prostrate that comes from the jackrabbits installation. And so they have a really large herbarium. And so if anybody is interested, you can find like thousands and thousands of specimens in this place. And so before the trip, we went to the herbarium to see what kind of plants we could find first. And so I think that was definitely also like an inspiration to really slow down and take a look at plants to identify them. Because I think at some point we were able to do that as humans, but we're not able to do that anymore. So I think slowing down and taking a look at nature was something that I was trying to do with this piece. This is where the seed pods and the leaf design comes from. This is the yellow show. And so again, this is a plant that was it's considered rare. And so how we found it is as I was going through the days in how to find plants, it's almost like when you turn off the light and you're readjusting your eyes, the same thing happens. Like your eyes are readjusting for what you're trying to find. And so all of a sudden, like everything is in a way green in this case, and then things start to pop up because they're different. And so that's how I was able to pick up on the plant, and we found this one. And so because we didn't know what it was, we couldn't pick it up, right? And so we just photographed it. And so so far there's been like a lot of questions from the seed pods, but they are very large and in real life. So original leaf to create my own leaf designs. And so at some point for the installation, I wanted to use the plants to create my landscape, but also at some point start to create different type of imagery for my plants, right? So I started to create my own image based on the leaf of the yellow show. And so there's two versions there. And so the one on the bottom is the one that I ended up using for the installation. And so those pieces are made out of resin. So I made an original from clay and then made a mold and then casted those out of resin. And then at some point, for me, like this, they start to be almost like organisms or creatures that start appearing in the work. So, so here are the seed pods at the top. And this is work that I did in 2016, and I just wanted to bring it back because something about the installations that I do is that they are temporary and they're site-specific. They're here, and I've always wondered like how I can show them again, how that would happen. I'm not very interested in recreating the piece again. I'm more interested in To me, I see it almost like an organism where if it appears again, it's like the same parts of it, but it's either a past of it or a future version of it, or a different, just a different way to see it. And so this is the only installation, and this one is object-based, where I have shown this before. And so this one is called In Production, and this is a little bit before I started working more focused on nature in the border. And this was done with Luis at Third Space, actually, and it was the first time that I started to take more in consideration installation. And so the second time that I installed it was at the Mexican American Cultural Center here in Austin. And so I called it In Production Second Manifestation. So it was still the same piece, but it is not the same piece at the same time. So it grew, it had different parts, it had more elements to it. The place was bigger. And so when I think of the installations, I think that they would grow, or they would show a different stage of them, whether it's past or present or future. Yeah. And so I think that's all I have. Yeah, thank you so much.
I'd like to invite both of our speakers to come back up to the front for some questions. So if you have questions out in the audience, start thinking about those, and Nicole will come around and you can ask your questions. Please wait for the microphone, because you won't be able to our participants that are on Zoom will not be able to hear your question. But you guys seem really far away all of a sudden. I'll come back over here. No, you're good. I'll move. I'll start off. I have lots of notes that I took now. There's sprawling questions, but I want to ask you both to, in some ways, comment. One of the things that struck me just now, hearing both your talks, is thinking about research and the way that you research your works. And it's obviously a long process. It's building for different works. But also one of the things that really strikes me about it is that you do research on a variety of topics, or very specifically for specific works, but you bring your own aesthetics to them. And I feel like all of your, Yareth, just going through, it's like, it's unmistakably your work, right? Once you understand what you're doing, it's like, of course, that's your work. And obviously Luis, you're creating a visual dialogue and vocabulary. So could you just talk a little bit about that? Like, how do you take something that's from a different source, and then you in some ways process it and you create it, and it makes it something that is yours?
Well, a lot of drawing. You draw, but you draw too, and I think that's one of the things that mark making is in our history as a human beings, beginning from the Lascaux caves and onward, which was a way of making sure that we told our story to the future. That's why the cavemen in those deep parts of the caves left stories and marks. And so when I look at things, I try to draw as much as possible. In any way, it can be a scribble, it can be a deconstruction of an object or a shape, and then repeat the shapes. And then in my case, I'm very three-dimensional because I learned how to make things at an early age, working in the assembly line of the ceramic flower shop. So we had to not only be able to cut shapes out and arrange them, but we had to also process them and shape them and form them. So I made the transition from cutting out and drawing to three-dimensional forms like that.
Yeah, I would say that I do installation, like that's my favorite way to work, because I feel like I can break down information, like deconstruct it from the original source. But also I'm a mixed media artist, so I do drawings. I also do sculptural objects. And I think a lot of the times I kind of just let the process guide whether that idea is going to turn into a drawing or an installation or a sculpture. And I think that kind of like broadens the process in what it could be, you know, through the research.
Questions from the audience? We have one.
Hi, I have a question for Luis, because you mentioned Nepantla, and can you just talk about, you know, where that word comes from and what it means, like in the Chicanx state?
Gloria and Saldua, pick up her book, El libro de Gloria, se llama. But anything that you read by Borderlands, anything you read by Gloria would be good. But that Nepantla is a now a term symbol representing the third space of existence. It's the time between the sun rising out of the darkness into the sky, and it's that pre-dawn, and it's also the time before the sun sets, right after the sun sets, and it's that pre-dusk. That is the place where creation occurs according to Mesoamerican texts and mythologies, and that Nepantla was written extensively as a place where our gente can create and imagine themselves into the future, into a new reality that can be hopeful and nourishing at the same time. So Gloria and Saldua, Borderlands.
Other questions? We have a question up here.
What made all this spirituality inspire you guys?
Can you repeat the question?
You guys make very spiritual creations, right? What made all of this inspire y'all?
I think that's a really good question. For me, I think that is part of what it has been taken away from us and trying to find it again as a brown person in a creative way as an artist.
In my case, I understand that we are reflections of the universe, and the universe is inside of us at the same time that it's outside of us. And I read a lot of quantum physics. Not that I can understand the mathematics behind it, but the metaphors that I read when I'm understanding, when I'm listening to Degrassi talk about quantum physics and how the most minute piece of matter can arrange itself in a format that is re-represented in ourselves, reminds me that everything around us is bigger than us. And so that led me to explore indigenous belief systems, because I just was not finding what I needed to find in the Eurocentric belief systems. So understanding that as a cosmic citizen and participant in this existence, I'm responsible to myself because my actions affect my well-being. And then I'm responsible to you and you because my actions affect your well-being. And then I'm responsible to the community because my actions affect the community, as well as being responsible to the earth because my actions affect the well-being of the earth. But more importantly, as a reflection of the universe, I think we carry the ability to balance things. And so I'm responsible to creating balance wherever I go. And that is what fuels my spirituality. I really just stumbled upon it by reading and researching and not being comfortable with what I was understanding from Eurocentric ideas of spiritualism.
So I want to kind of follow up with that and open a slightly different topic, but your work is very handmade, right? And both of you in different ways. I know you use technology maybe to get there, but when you're actually making the work itself, it's very handmade. Is that part of this connection that you're making? Do you feel that when is that purposeful? I find making things by hand can also be very meditative. And so is that part of the process? Is that it's also a necessity for artists, right? We have to do things with our hands. But just thinking about that, going off of that question about spirituality, and then thinking about these beautifully handmade works that both of you make.
Well, I think whenever we make objects, we imbue them with our energies. That's how come objects that are special get handed down to from one ancestor to a predecessor and so on. When I make stuff, I'm a printmaker as well, and understanding that I'm a printmaker, I know that nothing is really can go as planned. You have to be able to be flexible and understand the process that printmaking takes in order to have an outcome. So we go back to ideas of quantum physics. When we pay attention to an object and it changes, that's the same thing that I think that we have an energy when we make things, when we make objects. What we're thinking and what we're experiencing is being transferred into that object, whether we know it or not. And because of that, these objects can tell stories that we can use to explain bigger things, issues about environment, issues about social justice, issues about women's body justice, labor justice, human justice for any matter, really. So when we do these things, we have to be careful because our words have power, and we can manifest what we say, and if we're careful, we can manifest good things by just simply speaking about them or making objects that represent those ideas. You can see it very strongly in Yareth's work with her manifestation of the environment. And everybody really who's been brought together for this exhibit creates pieces that manifest their energy and their spirit behind the objects that they make. So when we make, we have a responsibility. And sometimes we have justice to the rest of us.
Yareth, you want to comment on the handmade quality of your works?
Yeah, so I would say, like I said, there's a lot of repetition in my work on the process. Like, for example, on the seed pots, there's only about 20 of them on the wall, but I didn't know how many I was going to need, so I casted 80 of them. And so it's the same process repeated over and over, every few minutes, the same thing, you know? And so it's almost like a ritualistic approach to, you know, that's a way of working, or like working on the wall and hammering like hundreds of tiny little nails and one little pin at a time. You know, it's like something about working with hands that is more about care, and I think that reflects into the pieces. So like you mentioned, like there's technology that we use, but you know, I've always been more interested in that idea of like working with your hands, and I think that it translates into the final product of the pieces.
Great. Questions? Is there a question from Zoom?
Unfortunately, no questions from Zoom, but I do have one question for Yareth. I know in one of your artist statements, you talk about being inspired by border types and the reaction to border types. Can you talk a little bit about that? And if you were inspired by the reactions, or it was reactionary for you to respond to such a call for border types at the border? Yeah.
Yeah, so that was back in 2018, more or less. And so it was when I was working on the yellow rhombus like piece for the Mexican American Cultural Center here in Austin. And so that was the first time that I was being very, very specific, where as my work where am I going to base it off? And so I was reading a lot about the border wall and what was happening. And one of the articles that I came across was when this was a time when Trump was the president, and he was very excited about the border wall and expanding that. And, to be honest, the border wall has been built before that, even with Obama, right? So, but he was very excited about the border wall, and he made a call for art almost. And so if you guys are creative people and you're familiar with like an art call, he did that for the border wall. And so there were people that were submitting border wall prototypes. And so there's a picture of him walking around, like checking out all of these border wall prototypes. And I just thought it was ridiculous. And then other people reacted in the same way, creative people, and they started to submit these ridiculous responses to the border wall. And, things like just an open border with hammocks everywhere and things like that. And so that was a huge inspiration, like to start the work and imagining like different border walls. So the drawings where there's a border wall with a bunch of holes so animals could cross through, because my whole idea is about like the organisms that are affected. So creating border walls where animals can cross, which are full of holes and things like that. So it's something that I think it's still not as straightforward, but it continues to inspire the work, because it kind of just allowed me to, again, like think about the border in a different way, and also in a funny way, because thinking about borders and border walls can be like very hard to hear, especially someone from the border like me. We've seen like the border wall go through, the University of Texas campus, it really cuts through it. And so, I remember seeing it without it and then after. So it does something to you. And so also as a way to kind of, make a joke out of it, that, the border walls can be any type of designs.
Hello, can you guys hear me? I have a question for each of you. For Luis, I noticed the word portal coming up a lot in your presentation. And I was wondering if you were drawn to particular locations that you feel like may have like energy centers, I guess you would call them. Are you drawn to those, or have ever worked with that idea?
I'm aware of locations like that, mostly temple, and I've explored Mesoamerican areas. I'm still researching more and looking forward to finding other locations. But what I've come up with is a structure that or a pattern of how a portal can be arranged. For example, cathedrals. Cathedrals are portals as well. And that's one thing that is present, and so because of the arrangement of the architecture on the footprint of the form, it creates the structure that's lined with the north, south, east, west cardinal directions, and then the central portion where the event happens is right in the middle of the axis mundi. So I read up on Joseph Campbell. I'm a student of Joseph Campbell, and so this collective idea of how humans are very similar thinking patterns, and is real embedded in what I do. So continuing to explore. Yes.
Thank you. And then for Yareth, a lot of your work is ephemeral, and is that out of utility? I mean, is that just because, you have a show and then you have to move on to another show, or are you really tied to the ephemeral qualities of your work? Like, do you prefer that it be ephemeral?
One of the reasons why I wanted or went the route of installation is because I have moved a lot in my life, and I wanted to do larger work, and I couldn't find a way to do it unless it was ephemeral like that. And I had done small installations before, and I was familiar with the process already. So it was something between truly being interested in the process of installation and just that idea of existing in that moment. but also out of necessity, because where would I put a piece like that after I'm done, you know? And so it kind of has allowed me to create more pieces like that, to just kind of work in the space and document them as best as possible.
Hi, you both mentioned about being intentional and careful with creating your artwork and having that translate by the end of the product for that care and that intention to be reflected off of it. I was just like curious to know, do you have like any traditions or rituals to get you into that like artistic zone before you create your art and your artwork?
I can't say that I have a specific process. I think that it's just kind of just music is one of them, and I listen to music that doesn't have any lyrics, and I think that kind of puts me in some sort of almost in a trance state, I would say, but I can't say that I have like a specific ritual aside from music without lyrics. Very important.
The process I follow is constant. My mind is always on, even if I don't have time to make something. I've kind of learned how to do that because I took the route of becoming an art teacher in order to get here, as opposed to jumping into my MFA and then getting a position as a professor somewhere. So that route took me through a different path that required me to be constantly on in my head and making sure that I was absorbing as much as I could and making. And so there's always some part of me working on making something in the back of my head as I'm handling different things. And so sometimes I'll go months without making anything, and I'll sit down on a weekend and I have a whole body of work that develops in just one weekend because of that. But it's from a constant process of following through the things that are experienced in life, the things we have to do, like go to work, eat, cook breakfast, clean the house. In my case, I go outside and I'm like my mom. I work with my plants and I propagate, I cut, I trim, I pull, I replant, and then I pay attention to the time that takes plants to grow. And I listen to music, and it depends, you know, what mood I'm in or what I need to feel like. Sometimes it'll be Ozzy Osbourne, sometimes it'll be Led Zeppelin, sometimes it'll be Los Panchos, or sometimes it'll be indigenous music. So that's what I do.
I want to go back. I really love this here, both their connections with nature too, is obviously, you know, part of the work and kind of fueling a lot of your things that inspire you, things that I think you also both feel a responsibility to. Nature being a part of that. I also want to think about circling back a little bit to futurism, but I also want to do that through the idea of modernism, which I think is also both in your work, maybe more in a sense of geometry, sense of symbolism in the way that you use different materials. And so I kind of I know that's a kind of a little bit of a meandering question, but thinking about that, thinking about like how, again, going back a little bit to aesthetics, like you're grounding your work in geometric principles, which are modern, but also ancient. And so does that help this time traveling aspect, you know, of your work where you're in multiple places at once because you're also in multiple times?
You want to go first? You want me? Both of us work big, and I think my mark making pieces is more of a ritual dance because of the size. And I make marks with my body movement as opposed to the small movement in my hand. The bigger body movements that allow me to create the curves and the shapes are all based on how my body can move based on a pivot point or something. And I work on the ground, so it becomes a dance and a pattern around the shapes when I create the forms. I do this when I carve as well because of the large scale carving. But the geometry and the forms that I bring in are something that's natural for me to make. That makes any sense because of the way I manipulate the shapes. That's where I'm at.
Yeah, I would say I had take a lot of inspiration from geometric designs and forms, as more specifically Platonic solids, which are all about time and space. And so I would say maybe that keeps it more modern in a way. I think at some point I defined like Chicanx for myself, and so for me finally I understood that I was being a hybrid, and so that's being two, and I started to embrace that. And so I think there's a lot of duality about two, and so being from two cultures, and a lot of things are like that. And so I think that maybe that ties it more to the past, or like kind of going back and forward on the work.
Well, it's also about perspective and taking a more holistic view of what we're making and how it connects to everything, as opposed to just being at the central point and running in line. So when you decolonize time, what you're doing is you're going up and down on the axis XYZ and then all the way around, so you can find different positions. And that's where the relationship of Italian futurism is best expressed, because of the advent of a different point of view that was taken that had not been seen before. And so if we take this position and look at it that way, I think that's where we get the ideas and the conceptual connections to other objects that we make or things.
Yeah, because you're transforming spaces, right? There's a transformation process from ideas, concepts, materials into a whole new experience. Like that place is never the same. Like that gallery wall will always be the gallery wall that work was on. There'll be other things on there eventually, but it'll always, I feel like, have that memory also, which is really amazing. And obviously we'll always think of that back part of the gallery there as the portal too, because that's really kind of amazing. So that is one of the reasons we really love to do those site-specific installations, is because it transforms the space very much. We have time for maybe one more question.
I'm thinking a lot about how I guess like how it seems like futurists or futurism movements are born out of a particular need from a place in time, from a particular group of people, and what is relevant and matters even specifically to you as the artist. And even in my own art practice, I'm thinking about like I borrow a lot from Vietnamese folktales and mythology to inform how I create certain things in my artworks. And I want to know how you, Luis, you mentioned like parallels between the Chicanx and Afrofuturism movements, and you have to, if you want to provide your input, but what parallels have you seen between different futurism movements that you find interesting, or just different like similar stories or topic areas that occur like across movements?
Well, holding space in the future is in our future is what seeing ourselves in a possibility, seeing brown people, seeing ourselves there, as opposed to the speculative ideas that don't see brown people there. So science fiction wise, that Ben Hogan, the writer, Chicano futurist writer, does this in his stories. But what we're doing, for example, in Afrofuturism was just that, imagining a better place for the future of African Americans, and Indigenous futurism is also doing the same thing, as well as Chicano futurism, Chicanx futurism, or Chicana futurism, Chicanane futurism. It all becomes labels that mean an idea that has been fermenting for a while, and it's the standing up of marginalized people, and how we can see ourselves making an impact that's positive in this place, because we're just going to be here for a bit. That's it. You know, and when you understand that temporality of the human body, and then make the connection of the temporality of the human body to the temporality of everything else that exists around us, then you understand the responsibility you have for the others that come after you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you both so very much for these great talks. I think it's a way to explore the exhibition, explore your work. And so I really want to thank both of you very much. So before we break, I want everyone to know that we have exhibition books that you're all welcome to take one, everyone in the audience here, on your way out. They're really phenomenal books that are bilingual that we created for this exhibition. So you're welcome to take one. You're also welcome to go up into the gallery for a few minutes. We're going to reopen the gallery. Those of you that would want to see the exhibition a little bit, and the artists will be up in the exhibition as well. So if you have additional questions, you can ask them. For everyone on Zoom, thank you so much for joining us, and I hope to see you soon at one of our other events. Thank you both.
Thank you.